Hello everyone, welcome back once again to this, our fourth and final video on the theme of poverty, specifically social exclusion, child poverty and food poverty. In our last video, I gave you a 1970s definition of relative poverty. And the 70s was a time when British sociology and British social work rediscovered poverty. It was something that we had overlooked. We gave it a lot more attention in the 1970s. I'm going to bring the whole discourse up to date. Where are we thinking about poverty now in the 21st century? Staying with the case of my birth country, the UK, which I think illustrates a lot of these questions really, really well. Again, to kick off this topic in a UK setting, we've just been looking at images of poverty. You had a look at the photos on my last handout. Now I wanted to do a bit of TV viewing. There's an excellent video on The Guardian. It's something like 9 years old. There's a link to it here, but you can simply enter the name of the video and you'll quickly find it in your favorite video search machine. Have a look, watch that video clip, discuss it with your friend. How do you feel hearing about such poverty in a rich country like Britain? How do you feel hearing about such poverty in a rich country like Britain? How do you feel the stories which the children tell? How do you feel about the comments that the children make? So watch that video and press pause here. You can unpause now. So I'm guessing you have some kind of reaction to that. Many of my students say that they find it quite shocking. My students tell me that they didn't know that such poverty existed. And I think that's one reason why they made that film video, to draw attention to how the other half live, so to say. My own reaction, well, of course, I watch it with a different context to you guys. I was born in Britain, I'm still a British citizen. And I share, obviously, your shock at watching that film clip. I have additional emotions. I feel a great deal of shame. As far as I'm concerned, poverty is something that governments, through their social policy, through their anti-poverty strategies, are able to reduce. And seeing that poverty in my birth country and seeing that we have a kind of tolerance of it, that we let it happen, so to say, is for me a very, very shameful thing. So for me, very much strong emotions. It's also heartbreaking. One reason why I personally find it heartbreaking to hear those stories is the weird normality of the poverty in those children's lives. To some extent, they don't really expect anything other than poverty. They're resigned to growing up in poverty. They don't really dream of a different life. For them, the poverty has an utter normality, which is what I find, yeah, heartbreaking and quite disturbing. So, yeah, rather sobering viewing there. Let's move on. Again, we're thinking sociologically about poverty, and I'm doing so from the position of my profession, social work. Who is at risk? This is an interesting question. Which groups of people in a global north country such as Britain, I think it's the same in Germany too, which groups of people do you think are most at risk of being affected by poverty? So what aspects of your person, your biography, for example, might statistically raise your risk, your chances of finding yourself living in poverty? I want you to pause now and make a list. Please note, to kick off your list, our last example, childhood. Simply by being a child, you have a statistically much higher chance of living in poverty. So that could be the top of your list, being a child. What other being a examples can you give? Things, aspects of yourself that statistically raise your risk of finding yourself living in poverty. Pause now. And unpause. What have you got on your list? Maybe many of the same points as I have here. Social scientists have studied this, and we have quite a good understanding of what the risk groups are. Children we've already mentioned, being disabled or having a disabled relative. Now, this depends clearly on which country you're living in. In many countries, there's extensive measures to kind of equalise the lives of disabled people, but in other countries there aren't. And in a country like Britain, being disabled, having a disabled child, having a disabled relative, like a disabled parent, will raise your chance of ending up in poverty. And the reason, of course, is quite simple. Caring is often seen as primarily a family responsibility in a society like the UK. Obviously, it shouldn't be. Obviously, that's as scandalous as the video we've just discussed. Actually, all of these points are themselves scandalous and things that societies are able to alter. Let's continue the list. Ethnic minority persons and also migrants, obviously disadvantaged in many subtle ways. These people are going to be disadvantaged and more likely to slip into poverty. Women, isn't that shocking? Explainable in various ways. The workplace is gendered, biographies are gendered. Older people, particularly in Britain, we have a lot of pensioner poverty due to the very low level of our state benefits. Our statutory state pension in the UK really is set at the minimal possible level. It used to rise with inflation when I was a child. Excuse me, it was a mistake. It used to rise with economic growth when I was a child, but there was a change in the policy a few decades back and they pegged it to inflation instead. So basically, the population has enjoyed economic growth, but older people haven't. Finally, people with a low educational attainment, once again, a particularly scandalous determinant, this one, because if you think about it, in a country like Britain, your education simply reflects the community you were born into. You know, give me a child's postcode and I can predict their exam results. Statistically, you know, for a bunch of 100 kids, I really could find quite predictable patterns there. So you can see for many people, there's a kind of vicious circle of poverty. Again, to make this sobering conversation even more frightening, please note, membership of more than one of these groups increases the risks even further. You know, so if I happen to be, say, a female migrant with children, you know, my chance of slipping into poverty, statistically speaking, is multiplied 3 times. So this is something that we have been thinking about, that some of us have been concerned by, that some politicians have tried to address, not just in the British context, but also in a wider sense, in a European sense, for example. And new terms have been used to express this common shared interest, common shared concern. A recent one from the last generation in particular, late 90s, early 2000s, was the discourse of social exclusion. So for me, very much around that time, the turn of the millennium, social exclusion became common in social policy discourses. Its opposite, of course, is social inclusion. Actually separating them is a really interesting thing to do. You've almost got 2 separate ideas there, even though they look like black-white opposites. Both terms describe processes in economies, processes in society. So both terms are not really a thing, but rather a process. What do they mean exactly? It's well worth pausing now and trying to define one of them. In a minute, of course, I'm going to give you a definition of social exclusion. So think about defining that. What is it exactly? Try and define it in a few words. Pause here and unpause here. What did you have? Once again, I can give you a quite well-known definition. The World Health Organization found this quite a useful concept, social exclusion, because it's so linked to health determinants. The World Health Organization definition, which comes from their website, my ones are undated. Exclusion consists of dynamic, multi-dimensional processes interacting across 4 main dimensions. They list these then: economic, political, social, and cultural. It results in unequal access to resources, to capabilities, and to rights. I'm not going to discuss this here, but I do invite you maybe to pause here, have a closer look at that. I find it really, really interesting. I like the 4 dimensions aspect, saying it is economic, it is political, it is social, it is also cultural. I find that really helpful. And this idea of this poverty limiting your access to resources. I might be thinking, say, of community resources, educational resources, and so on. Your access to capabilities. Oh, that's a wonderful term, isn't it? Your access to capabilities. I actually relate that word quite closely to the last word, your access to rights. Poverty may even restrict you from actually claiming your human rights. Again, for social workers, a fascinating idea that almost gives us a mandate, almost gives us a kind of orientation in how we do our work. Indeed, a social worker may say, in view of things like poverty, I'm a human rights worker, helping my clients to protect their human rights, despite their poverty or disadvantage. So for me, a definition which I can really play with and learn a lot from. Child poverty, we've talked about at the start of this presentation, very much for the Brits, maybe for some other nations too, a problem that won't go away. When I was your age, British politicians were addressing it. There'd been a kind of lull. Poverty kind of disappeared from political discourses in my childhood in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we celebrated material wealth. We didn't really focus on its opposite. But by the end of the millennium, people slowly started thinking about it more. Quietly, this didn't become a loud public debate, but it was definitely a theme in the politics around the turn of the millennium. And Prime Minister Blair, for example, when I was in my early 20s, a lot of his policies were focusing on children from poor families, and children from poor working families. We had this new concept of the working poor. People who were hardworking, they were in jobs, but they were kind of kept to the poverty line because of their low wages. Very much a feature, of course, of your classic liberal or neoliberal economy. Very much a feature, actually, of Anglo-Saxon society. We don't have much unemployment, but we do have people on horribly low wages that have similar lifestyles to the unemployed in other countries. And there's a bunch of policies that came, many of them very, very quietly indeed, tax reforms that really did help poor working families. And we had some exciting projects. One is a kind of social work project called Sure Start. And if you haven't heard about that, it's well worth investigating. I can really recommend learning more about that. I find it quite inspirational. Good. Things are happening, and actually the effect on the statistics was quite positive. Although, to put it into context, we had an economic boom in the early 2000s in the UK, and maybe that also helped reducing child poverty numbers. Nonetheless, what followed this phase in the early 2000s was the credit crunch, arriving in America and Britain 2007, 2008. The credit crunch led to joblessness. Brits ended up in debt. And then when they did then restart working, once again in very badly paid jobs. So effectively, yeah, Britain is still kind of caught in that post-credit crunch society. Parallel to this, governments are implementing large-scale welfare cuts. You know, the welfare state feels like it's shrinking and shrinking. In the years 2010, 2011, for example, politicians talked about cutting public services. You know, communities lost their libraries, for example. Councils had caps on their spending. So it's been a tough time for the public services in the UK. And increases in family poverty inevitably resulted. So although we saw improvements in the early 2000s, child poverty seems to be a problem that the Brits don't have the resources or the will to tackle. It's painful stuff. And we have new terminology thinking about poverty. Look at this term here, food poverty. For me, it's a new word. I hadn't heard that when I was a kid. I've got another clip for you to watch, another clip, actually an uploaded video, I think from The Guardian, by the Economic and Social Research Council. We've got a researcher, a young early career researcher, Hannah Lambie-Mumford, and she's talking about a really, really interesting project. She's trying to map the effect of food poverty in the UK. In particular, she's interested in food banks and how maybe they alleviate this. I think it's really, really interesting research. Watch it. My question for you, what do you think of this research project? Could you imagine yourself doing this kind of research? I think it's a really interesting example of current poverty research in Britain today. Well, this slide, this thought takes us to the end of this, the last of my presentations on this topic of poverty and inequality. Hope you found it interesting. Once again, interesting reading. There's a whole bunch of books out there which I get really excited by. If you're a sociologist, if you're a social worker, isn't this an interesting topic, even though it's also a sobering one and at times a heartbreaking one? Hope you've enjoyed these talks. Look forward to seeing you in my other videos. Thank you.